Hey, I'm Grant. Welcome to Second Plate, a show all about reusing ingredients and trying to find recipes that just flow together really well. So tonight we're going to be making some homemade tomato soup. It's a great option for just being able to buy a lot of tomatoes. I like that I can buy a whole bunch of tomatoes for like sandwiches, for omelets, whatever, and I have this as a fallback because really all it takes is some fresh tomatoes, any extra veggies that you have, like we'll be using onions, garlic, stuff like that, and then you basically just need a broth of your choice. I'll be using beef broth, but I find that I pretty much always have ingredients for this around in my kitchen, so it's just very convenient to kind of put together. So let's get cooking. Okay, I'm going to start off with actually forming, or rather cutting this onion. So I'm just going to go through and do this pretty quick. I have been trying to get a lot better with my knife skills, particularly when it comes to onions, because I feel like I'm just constantly chopping them for my own use at home, where I'll just go ahead and buy a onion, chop it up, and it's like, oh, I know I'll use it on say a sandwich or in omelets or just to throw in wherever. I've lately just been doing some frozen vegetables at home and then spicing them up with just some simple garlic, onions, just to kind of really give them more flavor. So as part of that is I've been trying to improve just the speed, and I can't quite get it down, but it's definitely a lot better than when I started this show. But I'm just going to go through here, slice it, try and hold it together. As part of the whole getting better at slicing onions, I actually went and I got a better knife just so I can't blame it on my tools. Okay. But we're just going to go ahead and get these up fairly small. There is, I believe, a completely correct way to slice an onion very fast, but I do not have that down, and I do not have a sharp enough knife where I trust myself, because basically it involves making several cuts lengthwise, and you turn it, and you make one right across this to kind of pre-cube it, and then you just go through and you just slice it all really cleanly. And while that is my eventual goal, I need a lot more practice before I'm ready to do that willingly. So I'm just going to slice this all up. You can omit this if you want, but generally speaking, I like onions. Like I said, I just use them in a lot of recipes. And part of that is just because it seems like, for whatever reason, onions are always way bigger than I want. I was actually surprised that this one's kind of small, and that's why I got that particular one. Because it just seems like I'll get these giant red onions, and it just gives me so much more onion than any other ingredient in my recipe. So it's like, oh, tomatoes, I know I'm going to use all the tomatoes for this recipe, but I'm definitely not going to use the whole onion. So I'm just going to kind of drizzle these here. The overall point of what I'm going to be doing here is I'm actually going to be baking these in the oven to kind of prepare them. To be honest, I don't fully understand why baking and kind of drying out tomatoes makes them better, but I can definitely tell you it does. If anything, I've actually taken to doing it just for simple stuff like sandwiches, because it's so much more convenient to not have the juices flowing out everywhere. So just got my tomato, going to cut out this stem area. I believe there's an actual name for this, but for the life of me I could not tell you because it's not the core, but it's basically the core. There. Just going to then cube these, or not cube, cut it into fourths. Big enough that they're still completely together, but I want to make it basically have some surface area so that when I eventually have to kind of mash these down after they've roasted, it's easier. And you could probably do this entirely whole or do it in halves, but I found that fourths just seems to work the best for me and my kitchen. One other reason I like this recipe is I find that I have not only just leftover tomatoes, but I always have half of a tomato cut up in my fridge, because if I want to go make a sandwich, you want say a slice or two. Come on, there we go. But generally speaking, I'm going to choose like the most optimal part of the tomato for my sandwich. So I'm going to take like a slice right out the middle. But I don't want to throw away the rest of the tomato, so you get tomato soup. Also, I found that with tomato soup, it's very easy to make exactly the amount you are going for. So like if I wanted to make tomato soup just for myself, I can, but it's extremely easy to scale it up if you need to, say, make it for 10 people. Okay, just gonna get this garlic. As part of like learning some better knife skills, I've been trying to actually chop my garlic instead of using the garlic press like I normally do. It's not always ideal, but to be honest, while that garlic press does save me a lot of time, I find it extremely annoying to clean. But really, I think it's just kind of picking your poison, because it just seems like every time I go to deal with garlic, each one is just its own thing. Like this one, it's extremely, basically it's lacking like an arch compared to some of these other ones. So it makes it really hard to like kind of break it open like that one does. Now I'm like, oh man, I should have brought the garlic press because this one's being particularly annoying. Or sometimes there's like, it's just a pain to remove the skin. Other times it just comes off effortlessly. And I've seen no shortage of like fancy tricks to remove that. But it seems like it's a 50-50 chance no matter what you take. So if there is a truly objectively great best way to peel up your garlic, I have yet to find it. Okay, I'm just going to do the same as what I did with the onion. Okay, just cut it up. One thing I find interesting about garlic is it's drastically easier to work with the more you are cutting up. Because like if you have to cut up a whole bulb of garlic, so essentially like, 10 cloves or more, it's really easy because you can just kind of get them all there and just dice it up like this. But if you had to dice exactly like 1 clove of garlic, it is extremely frustrating because it just sticks to the blade and all that, which is why usually when I'm at home, I'll opt for the garlic press just because it's very much like a one and done thing. Okay, I'm gonna get these nice and fine. I'm just really eyeballing how tiny I want some of this stuff because later on, we're gonna actually determine how chunky we're gonna make this soup. And as part of that, and this is a great tip that I found very useful with soup in general, is just taking some of it out and blending it, because that way you can, right then and there as you're cooking it, choose your consistency, where if you want extremely creamy, extremely, I don't know, non-chunky, I don't know if that has a specific word, then you can just blend it all. But if you want it to be like really solid and chunky, then you just do less or don't do it at all. But I'm just gonna get this all here. The goal being that there's gonna be a lot of runoff and juice from the tomatoes. I'm gonna actually slice another one in there. And it's gonna kind of pool with the onions. And later on we'll be adding some oil and such. One thing that's actually convenient that I unfortunately do not have a solution for is you can cook this all in the same pan, but I do not have a pan that can go in my oven that I would also have on the stovetop. But that's what's kind of nice, because then you essentially just deglaze the pan and you get all those like nice juices to come out. I do find like cutting vegetables to be very calming, and I've been trying to, with doing this whole cooking show, basically prep like very far ahead of time, because now that I use a lot of garlic, it's a lot easier just to be like, hey, I just bought a whole clove, let me just peel it all and get it down to where it's like nice and convenient to work with. That way, I just need to pull it out. And once you kind of do stuff like that, all of a sudden, like, it's not a big deal to make these kind of more ornate, interesting foods. So I've got my olive oil. So I'm just gonna drizzle some olive oil all over. Again, if you can do this all in one pan, this is really convenient, because then you can like saute your onions and stuff in that same pan, and you just kind of keep it hot and keep it going while the tomatoes start to break down. Okay, so I have my oven here. It's set to about like 200 degrees. Really, there's no incorrect temperature, because all I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting this in, and I'm going to wait for the tomatoes to kind of like dry out, roast down, and I'm ideally looking for them to start becoming very soft. If you wanted to, you could toss them probably straight in to a stovetop and cook it directly, but for some reason, I just find it does work better. And I would recommend this in general, just working with tomatoes. Like doing, I almost forgot my salt. Like working with tomatoes in general is something where I feel, I really like tomatoes, but to do it correctly, it's something I'm often just too lazy for. Like even if you are just using like tomatoes for like a sandwich or something, you should still actually like salt and drain them like in the sink, and that's just like, that can be a little bit too much extra work for me when I want just a sandwich. Because honestly, if I'm making a sandwich, I'm pretty much admitting I'm going to be lazy about it. So while those are cooking, just some other stuff I want to briefly talk through. So I have some extra additionals that we're going to be adding once it comes out. I've got some tomato paste. I got this for another project, basically. But the tomato paste and then also sun-dried tomatoes, this is essentially just a shortcut I've found useful when I was practicing this, where the bulk of the dish is going to be made up by our fresh tomatoes. But you can actually get a lot more like flavor out of some like pre-made stuff. So just by mixing it in, you can get a little bit more of a succulent like taste to it. Like it'd be a whole thing to make tomato soup entirely out of sun-dried tomatoes. But if you have enough in there just to like make it noticeable, it can have a pretty big impact. And then also it really, it makes cooking the tomatoes a lot more flexible. You don't have to be as exact because it's not carrying the whole heart of the dish. So anyway, we're going to wait for those to cook down for about 10 to 20 minutes. Just keep an eye on them. I'm basically looking for them to kind of dry out and just sizzle. Usually that's kind of like what I start to listen for, because with all the olive oil, the onions in particular will start to just fry and get ready. So I'll be back in about 10 to 20 minutes. After the tomatoes have been in there a good long while, they're going to start getting pretty soft. And usually this is what I just check. Again, this is technically optional, so they don't have to be perfect. If you wanted to, you could leave them in there much longer. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to pull these out. I'm going to add them onto the actual pot we're going to be cooking the soup in, and we're going to finish them there. So I'll go ahead and get this started. Gas. Pull this out. Cool. Just shift this around. I just added some simple pan spray to this. Looks like I lost a tomato. And also there's still plenty of olive oil actually on this from before. That's why I actually put so much on. So I'm just going to make sure I get all of that, because that's also going to end up in the soup. Nice. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and add some of our side ingredients. So I just got some tomato paste. Just going to put a bunch of that in there. It's basically just concentrated tomato. It's something where it's not a big deal not to have it, but I found it very convenient to do that. Got my sun-dried. Again, this is not necessary, but what's nice about the sun-dried tomatoes is they're essentially what we just did in the oven, except much better done and for a long time. So I'm just going to add effectively most of them. These are also like something that's kind of nice just to have around, because you can put them in a lot of great recipes, but it's hard to, like, for at least in my eyes, justify buying it just because. So it's like, oh, I'll buy them for, say, my tomato soup, and then if I want to use them on like a sandwich or in some other recipe, I can. Or like, one thing that I have found very convenient is a lot of times when I'm like doing stuff for this show, I'll actually end up with this like kind of like odd leftover ingredients. Just gonna stir these around and get them all covered. And then those like leftover ingredients like sun-dried tomatoes are actually what drives me to find the next recipe, because that's literally what the show is built on, is that, hey, I have these leftover food, like ingredients, what can I turn these into? And that just kind of like one thing leads to another. Smasher, cool. So I'm just gonna get in here and start breaking these down, just with a little bit of a masher. This is the point where you wanna decide how chunky you want your soup. Because I could also easily just blend these up if you want it to be extremely smooth. But since these are gonna take a little while to kind of cook, I like to mash them, makes it really chunky. Plus, I'm a huge patron to the idea of cleaning as you cook, and it's extremely easy to clean a potato masher. Whereas like if I were to get out my blender or some other contraption, that's not always ideal, because it's this whole thing. So I'm like, yeah, I'll just mash it down, and then if I decide I want it to be less chunky, I can always fix it a little bit later. And that's one thing I feel like I've just really noticed with soup. First of all, soup's amazing. It's so easy to make, and you can get so much mileage out of it. But also because just how soup kind of works, I find that it's very hard to mess up, because you can effectively just keep correcting over and over. So I've got some beef broth. You can use chicken, vegetable stock. Really up to you. But I'm just gonna go ahead and add this and let it come back up to heat. Cool. Just add a little more salt. I'm gonna put in my pepper as well. Salt. Some black pepper. I have some cayenne pepper. This is where it's like, it'll just give it like some bite. Not so much that I would ever actually describe it as spicy, but it definitely does bring something to it. And I've been using cayenne actually a lot recently, because I can tell there's plenty of times like, I want something, but I don't want it fully spicy, but just like a little bit of something. Okay, I'm gonna add some Worcestershire. Really anything acidic to help taste. I'm just gonna keep stirring. Cool. One thing I also really like about this recipe, and get back in here and mash this, is while I can stand over here and like really dote on my tomatoes, you can also cook it in such a way that's very hands-off. Like, if I was in a pinch, really you could probably just dice up a tomato, throw like some stock in. You could omit, like say, the onions even. All that's just flavor. But you could just let that cook down, simmer, checking on it, and you don't have to worry about it. Just essentially preparing itself just in the background while you make something else. Like actually, one of the things I wanted to include in the show is I wanted to find some good pairing with tomato soup, because you can do, say, like a grilled cheese or a melt, but I felt like that wasn't exactly what I was looking for on the show. I wanted something a little bit more unique. And one thing I actually came across that I think I might try to recreate was I found cheddar jalapeno bread. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting, because I wanted to do something like that where you had like melted cheese, but I didn't want it to be too over the top or too simple, if that makes sense. Just something that's like a nice corollary to go with the soup. Or I know like when I was cooking this, I like to serve it for myself just with bread, because after recipe's like actually done, it usually comes out like too hot, because basically like the recipe makes a good amount just because of how many tomatoes you can put into it. And while I'm waiting for my soup to cool down so I can eat it, you can still like have the bread and like dip it in and get kind of started. And it definitely takes it to the level of like a simple soup to almost more of a comfort food. But just going through down here while I wait for this to kind of come back up to a boil. One thing I have omitted here that I've seen several recipes do is they would add cream to this. And that definitely makes it a lot richer, but it does change the color, which isn't a big deal, but if you ever see tomato soup and it comes out almost like more of a orange than a red, that's pretty much exactly why. And it really does improve the flavor, and to a certain extent the texture makes it, by definition, creamy. So it's something that you can definitely look into. Like if I was gonna have like some kind of like dinner party, I think pretty much for sure I would just put in a lot of cream. It's effectively just like butter in any other dish where if you want it to be good, just use a lot of it. But if I'm just doing this for myself at home, it's something I can choose to omit. And there's a lot of other ways you can just change this up. So like instead of olive oil, you can effectively use butter, kind of drizzle that on, cook them in the pot. You can fry up the onions in it, and it'll give it a slightly richer taste without having to use the cream. But I'm just going through here, and what I'm effectively doing, if this doesn't come across, is I'm just mashing it down, kind of twisting it, because what I'm trying to break down is the individual skins of the tomato, because that's by far the hardest part. Let's see if I can fish out a good example of this. I don't think this kind of comes through, but as you'll cook, you'll end up with these large bits of the actual skin of the tomato that are all lining the bottom, and I'm effectively trying to shred those up. You could also just cook this for much longer, but it's kind of nice if you can get that taken care of now. But effectively, once this starts getting down to a good semblance of the soup, I'm going to start just tasting it. And while I think this is a very stereotypical image, I like to have a tasting spoon just on my oven when I make soup. And I even have like a dish for it that's solely so you can, let's say, put down a spoon like this on your stovetop without getting it dirty. But what I'll do is I'll take a spoon, actually fish some out, set it down for it to cool while I continue working, and then I'll just taste test, like, okay, could it use some more salt? Just put more salt in. Okay, could it use some more pepper? Okay, put some pepper in, stir it, come back. And I really like how iterative soup is for that reason, because with like me getting into cooking, one thing I've kind of noticed is I think a huge benefit of, say, working in a restaurant or going to like a culinary school is just the fact that you get to make food in such large amounts. Whereas if you're at home, like in theory, I'm eating like 3 meals a day. How am I going to get like over 1,000 hours of like mastery in any like one like dish or skill if I can only do it realistically once per day? And then if you like factor in all the other stuff I assume you want to cook, like baking, you have like different forms like meats and like steak, and I would love to be good at that. But with soup, you can kind of have those iterations to like learn all from like one singular dish. And it's pretty hard to actually, I think, ruin soup, because worst case scenario, let's say I just completely oversalt everything. Like this is way too salty, I put in way too much cayenne pepper. All I can do to fix it, or all I need to do to fix it, is I can simply add more of my broth. Or I can even go as far as just, okay, I just got more tomatoes, just put them in, dilute it out. And I really find that convenient. Also, I think the most convenient thing about soup in general for myself is just the fact that really, as long as I have stock and any vegetables at all, you can make soup. It might not always be like literally the picture perfect tomato soup, but it's always going to be something like, okay, it's basically chicken noodle soup but without chickens. You can always make something like that, and it's having just stock around has like saved me so much just like time and money on not wasting ingredients but still making like a homemade good meal. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and dish this up. Cool. Do want to do more pepper. One thing I'm always like concerned about more than anything is over salting it. So like I like to be pretty generous with the pepper, but one thing I've personally learned to watch out for, and why I mentioned the over salting, is a lot of these ingredients can have just salt in them. So I might feel that, hey, I put in the same amount of salt all the time, or man, I'm really trying to find some like consistency. just because I chose to, say, put in like the sun-dried tomatoes, now all of a sudden it's oversalted, even if I didn't put really much salt in at all. So that's one thing I do want to kind of call out. Just let this cook down. And I'm going to let that boil for a couple minutes until they start to really break down. After it's been boiling for a little while, it should start to just break down more and more. And really, since this doesn't have any meat in it, the only thing we're even like cooking it for is to kind of like mix stuff together and actually get the tomatoes to break down. So really, at this point, this is just kind of a judgment call, like when you feel that it's actually nice and done. So as is, this is a really thick soup. You can still see all of these tomato skins. So I'm actually going to be taking this out. I'm going to be blending some of it just right here. And that really helps smooth it out. It's not technically required, but I think it does help. And the biggest thing is just after I came across it in one recipe, and as I would continue to make soups, just knowing that it's an option, like an extra tool of sorts, has been really helpful. So I'm just going to get essentially the thickest parts. Again, I could also just stew this longer, or I could spend more time mashing. If you want to, I assume, throw like money at the problem, you can get a hands like stick blender and you can just blend it all in the pot. Just gonna go here, make sure I don't have anything sticking to the bottom of my pot. And I usually like to get maybe a cup or two out, depending on the size. And we're going to get a good consistency for here. And basically what I'm looking for is I want it to be essentially diced up into smaller chunks where I've broken down any large skin. If you want to, you can just let it run entirely until it's just completely a liquid. Again, with soup, it's just, there's so much that's just entirely personal preference. I'm just going to take that off, and then add it back into our soup, and let it come up to temperature and serve it. One thing I feel like soup in general, but especially like a long stewing tomato soup would be perfect for, is just the fact that you can kind of just keep it cooking. It'd be ideal if you had to, like, say, cook for several people, but it's not a big formal thing. So people might go back, get more. Maybe not everyone's there, so it's definitely a great option for a good, like, family meal. But we're going to go ahead and serve up our tomato soup, taking care to actually get some good chunks in it. And again, if you like really creamy, smooth soup, I would just add some more cream to it at pretty much any step in the cycle. Generally, I would also garnish this a little bit, like with some herbs. Up to you what you want, but I just call that out because while you can add them to the actual dish, it's nice having some extra green to contrast the red, and you just add it at this step. So here we have our cooked tomato soup. Again, this is just a great, awesome dish for just making at home for really just any reason. It makes great leftovers. It's really easy to store, and you can honestly just keep kind of coming back to it and doing more and more with the recipe. So this has been Second Plates. I'm Grant. Thanks for watching.